These are triangles of the board. And some of the special people that made this happen, some of my colleagues and friends, Barry Bloom and Claudia Bush. And before we continue, I see a lot of alumni here from the three departments. Can you all stand up really quick to see where you are? This is Fall Week, and it's great to have you all here. Come on, let's go. Thank you. And to introduce Dr. Tschumi, I want to invite Dr. Leach, who is the director of the Doctor of Design program, the DDES program that we have here at FIU.
Wow, welcome Bernard. The last time I saw a lecture like this, that was contravening the fire regulations, it was almost Slavoj Žižek. The students were hanging from the chandeliers and everywhere. So it's great to see you all here. I want to say a few words, because I've often mentioned Bernard in my lectures from this very spot here. I get these people looking at me curiously. And I just want to say something about why Bernard is so significant. Well, you all know the building, right? But there's more to it than that. Bernard is a very, very eminent theorist. In fact, when I first started writing Rethinking Architecture, all the people I was referring to, Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, Benjamin, and so on, Derrida, they were already in Bernard's work. So he had planted the seed, and all I was doing was following up on that. And my book, Anesthetic, was based on one particular sentence from one of Bernard's essays. So he's been a hugely important theorist back in the past, introducing all this radical French thought that's coming out of May '68. And I would say if you want to understand this building or this courtyard, you've got to really think about some of the ideas emerging. Coming out of Henri Lefebvre, the notion of the moment or work of Guy Debord, the situation. But most importantly, I think Bernard's notion of the event. And this is an event space. An event is where something happens. And those walkways, those staircases, are places that are intended to promote and invite, shall we say, invitation. For Bernard, a building is activated by the users. And in that respect, he has invited us to put life into, invitare this building through our own presence. So we, in some senses, are complementing or fulfilling the building that Bernard set the seed for. Bernard has really had a very, very significant role as a dean. I was talking to Biaina, who studied there, and about the many people who come out of Columbia. I had the great fortune of being invited by Bernard to teach there back in 1999, when I was a super young man. All I can remember is that I said yes before he finished his sentence. Would you like to come and teach? And I said yes. It was really an astonishing moment. Columbia at that time was a melting pot. Evan Douglas described it as a kind of perfect storm of all these kind of talented individuals, the designers, the thinkers, people like Manuel Delanda, Greg Lynn, the designers and so on, all came together to make this kind of radical moment when Columbia was transformed. And I think that Bernard's second sort of primary role has been that of a dean. And I would say that there are very few others that I would put in that category. Maybe Alvin Boyarsky at the AA, possibly Peter Cook at the Bartlett, who's taken on a school and transformed it into something that is truly remarkable. And the legacy of that is to be found all over the world today. A number of, Henry, of course, as our chair, who was himself there, but there are many other people, even my own students. At least Andrushek was a student of mine, and there were several other directors of schools around the world. I'd love to see a map of the world with all those people, and literally the whole world that's been populated by that. I was a student myself in Emmanuel College, Cambridge, which was founded 450 years ago, roughly. And Elizabeth I was, to mark the moment, she planted an oak tree. And she planted an oak tree and she said, who knows what fruit this will bear? Well, a few years later, there was someone called John Harvard who studied there. And eventually he went and made his way across to this side of the Atlantic. And of course, the rest is history. Harvard University is named after it. And I think this is what Bernard has done. is set the seed, who have planted the thing. You know, who knows what will happen? Who knows what will happen in terms of the way we activate this building? Who knows what will happen in terms of the theoretical ideas he's thrown out there? And who knows what will happen in terms of this institution? I mean, already we have the Doctor of Design program, which I think is a kind of world leader, with professors from the Bartlett, from SoA, from NYU, from Cornell, and who knows elsewhere coming here. So I would just like to say to Bernard, thank you. You have done something very, very special here. I hope that it's living up to your expectations of what it could be, and it's truly a great honor to have the person, the architect behind this incredible, I don't know what to call it actually. It's a kind of, it's something that's been activated by all you. It's a kind of an ensemble, it's something very, very special. One final thought that I want to say is that you know, Bernard, not only was he writing about these famous people, these famous theorists, Walter Benjamin and Derrida and so on, but actually Jacques Derrida wrote a very impressive essay, which we were talking about in our D-Day session on Sunday, about Bernard's Part de la Diète, Point de folie maintenant l'architecture, which is the most incredible essay because it's reading Derrida's whole project into these pavilions. And to be honored in that way by one of the world's greatest philosophers is truly remarkable. So welcome, Bernard. I look forward to your lecture, and I look forward to the next 25 years when the seed that you've sown here grows into something more like a nature itself. Thank you.
Well, I must leave. I'm late already.
Before we start, I would like to invite Dr. Osejas and President Mike, if you want to say a few comments to students.
All I would say is I'm very proud of what has transpired over the last 25 years, and I'm very grateful to Paul Sejas, who is the political and powerful father of this school. We worked together to make it possible. And Bernard, what an honor to have you, to see you again.
Thank you.
Mitch is very generous on his remarks. It was a partnership, and he was the one who convinced us to get Bernard to design this. And of course, it was revolutionary at the time, and it still is. But I played a very small part. President Mike was the backbone and supported all of our efforts. And Bernard, he couldn't have made a better choice. When we met in Paris, and you show us what you could do, and he was doing a lecture, and I remember he invited us to the lecture, and there was an auditorium basically this size, and it was packed, but there were lines of people waiting outside, trying to let the doors open so that they could listen Bernard speak and lecture the students. Bernard, after 25 years, we just saw pictures and we looked just the same. So, Bernard, thank you very much. It's great to see you again, and many happy years, and enjoy his talk.
You can change with this and walk around, and if you need to point at anything, you can press this.
Yeah, I won't need to point,
but you can go left and right.
Fantastic.
And then let's just turn this on. Excuse me. All right. Mic check.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Look, it's actually quite an emotional moment. It's fantastic to be back here. And thank you for all being there. I want to thank some of the people who have just walked out. In other words, Paul Sejas and Modesto Melike. And I also want to say a word about an incredible dean at the time who was, yes, leave the light on for now. Yeah, leave the overall light. Dean Bill McMinn, who was somehow an incredible lovers of architecture and ready to take chances and ready to introduce something that doesn't happen too often these days, you know, an architectural competition, and we started to work on this with incredible young graduates from Columbia University at the time, where I was a dean, people like Gustavo Barenblum or Claudio Busch, Ansav de Beaurecueil, and a few other young people who were literally in their 20s. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, and something that I seem to recognize here with another younger faculty, Neil Leach, John Stewart, and a few others who have carried the flag, and I think this is really important. Also, people who were within the profession here in Miami, like Bruno Elias Ramos, that was also teamwork. So the reason why I bring these few names, and also there was then after Dean McMahon, Juan Bueno, it's a number of situations and circumstances which are always important when you start a project. You don't do it only on your own, you need the enthusiasm of the people you work with. So let me tell you what I'm going to do today. First, I'm going to show a few images which are in a sense rediscovered in the last few days, early sketches, early drawings, early models of this particular building we're in. And so what I would like to do is first to show you a little bit that work, right? How it became a real building. And then I'll backtrack and I'll try to explain how we got there. So in other words, it's a sort of simultaneously about this place and about what preceded it and what followed it. And what I would like to try to convey is that there is a common thread. And the common thread can be expressed very simply. It's all about concept, but concept as it's confronted with context, and how concept and context go back and forth and influence themselves, each other in a mutual manner. So let me start with some of these images. So now we can turn the light down. The word generator was used at the very beginning. We knew, of course, Miami, fantasy ideas, film and television series and so on. And so an FIU, these were existing at the time, mostly some car parks, yes, but some now have been transformed into buildings. So it was a site that somehow didn't have yet the identity that it has now. And when we started working, this is an aerial, when we started to work, these are the images you know very well, but when I start working on a project, generally, I literally take an old piece of paper and I scribble, I try to see how to make a cortex scheme inherently extrovert into an introvert urban friendly scheme. So there are a series of notations of small sketches really asking questions, of saying, hey, what is it about? And trying to determine where the questions might reside. And I insist on that word question because that's what drives the scheme as you're testing things out. You don't need computers, you just often do them in the back of a taxi or in the plane of a seat. It's really a mode of thinking, and you test certain diagrams. I hate to call them sketches, but they're simply shorthands or shortcuts. And so what I'm showing you here is a series of those very, very early diagrams or notations, as I call them sometimes, when you do not know necessarily everything about the building and what is needed, but you have sufficient understanding to intuitively to take a few shortcuts and test certain ideas. And here I'm showing you literally the very first point, which are also something that you use in order to, how could I say, to engage in a dialogue with your immediate team. You're not talking to the client, you're not talking to the authorities, you're not even talking to people at the school. You're trying to make up your mind about what it might be. Look, you know, the first images of this building, right, where we're sitting at the moment. So it becomes, and this, you know, I've seen that, so somehow it's an exploration of the mind. It's something which at that time is almost a pure concept. It's a pure abstraction. It's not, no discussion yet about materials. Materials are very important in architecture. But at that time, it's just trying to, and then you test it on the actual site, which you of course know before you do those early sketches, but that gives you a sense of dimension, and that allows you to also to have other people start to draw them with machines. And this is probably indeed done in an airplane or so. So one is literally starting to get a sense of what the overall dynamics of the building is. And of course, you know, I don't need to go into too many details about the two quote generators, the group of palm trees, which was in a sense a way to discuss the issue of nature, and then the two wings which have their own particularities. So these drawings, which I found just in the last few days, were literally the first test, and the, I would say, in many ways, still exploring the vocabulary of those conceptual decisions. So the reason why I insist on this distinction between, on one hand, something which is entirely diagrammatic, which doesn't have a form yet. The sketches, the hand sketches, are not about form. They are only about ideas. And then at that moment, you start to test things. And you test them, and you have people you're working, you know, in your team, and you tell them, look, okay, there is that volume, which is, as Neil, thank you, Neil, for your introduction, they are somehow event spaces. You want to talk about the movement vectors, in other words, how it becomes a meeting point, a crossing path. And your team tests things out, some which you will not keep. Because probably very important in the way we work, we always test a number of alternatives. We develop a concept. Maybe first we test different concepts, we choose one, and then we test always a number of options or alternatives. The reason why I'm saying that, you know, there are some architects who stick to one single image. In our case, I think we always test different versions, different options, in order somehow to get to know what you're dealing with. And that's the moment when you start to question construction systems. It's when you start to question issues of mundane stuff like ventilation and like acoustics and things like that. But it's really important to understand that there is not one single solution, that there are always different variations. And those variations sometimes can be selected through very rational justifications, but sometimes they get selected for possibly something that I would hesitantly call poetics, is something that somehow changes a little bit the regular rationale of architectural, quote, quote, received ideas. The dictionary of received ideas of architects is enormous. There's a lot of cliches. And so you test strange animals, you do things which too much, but conceptually right, you know, November 99. So, and then you explore materiality, you explore how you're going to put it together. And at that time, yeah, these are early sketches, you're still making sure that the overall concept, and I insist on this word, is developing towards something which is going to be materialized. Now, I use the word materialized because architecture is relatively particular. It's very different from philosophy or from mathematics. In other words, there's a moment when it gets not necessarily built. Most of the time you want it to get built, but it is in reference to something that gets built. So in other words, the materialization of a concept is something that is inherently architectural. If I'm a mathematician, I don't deal with actual physical material, you know, that sort of sound, or a philosopher. So that relation to how you build it goes to amazing circumstances. I'll give you the example. I'm sure you're familiar with it. The budget was tight. The technology was fairly iffy. How could you do something which would be done in a precast manner? And we were told about parking garage and prefabrication systems. So we decided to turn the building as a series of planes, and those planes being 45 feet long, which is the largest length you can put on the back of a truck, and can't remember actually, about 10 or 12 feet wide. And so this almost house of cards game became extremely fascinating as a way to bring constraints that would suggest a coherence or a unity in terms of the approach to the construction system, and at the same time introducing a number of sort of disconnects which were intentional in terms of activating the whole set of space. These are construction photographs. At first we were going to have the tiles being applied in the factory, but what we discovered with great excitement and anxiety is that when you lift a huge piece of 45 feet long concrete slab, it actually bends. It's like a sheet of paper, and the tiles would, of course, have flown away if we had. So the tiles were brought in by hands, but the pieces were quite an extraordinary sort of adjustment, and then and as you can see, then they are applied by incredibly sort of dedicated tilers who, but that's a longer story. I won't have time to get into my fascination for an architecture that was somehow, we felt, had to be close to a Florida or southern sensibility. But actually I'll come back to this in a minute. So these are some of the joints of the connection. Here are how the pieces were arriving on trucks. So much of the detail of the joints had to do indeed how you put these parts together. And here they come. I think this one is one of the rare pieces which had tiles because of the cantilever, and it's very hard for a tiler to put tiles when you're on a cantilever. So I think we did that one earlier, and well, you know that. Okay. Interior, I just bring them. I just was excited to see that much of it had been beautifully sort of maintained by your team here. So the point is that somehow the question is where it came from. It didn't come out of the blue. And so what I would like today is to try to track back a thinking process which has indeed to do with that strange back and forth between what I call concept and context. So let me go really far back. When I came out of architectural school, it was a very strange moment. We get to a time when probably none of you were born yet. It was the 1968 events. You've heard about that, whether it was in Europe or in America. There were an enormous amount of questions which were related to social, to political, to even to wars, the Vietnam War or the Algerian War in France. In other words, really serious questioning about where society was going at the time, and also something that had to do with perhaps 20 years of certainties which had been the post-Second World War era, where the modern movement had developed a very secure vocabulary, sometimes incredibly beautiful, but at the same time in manners that people were hesitant about, indeed because of those social, political, economic questions. Young architects, in other words, people your age, were asking those questions, and some were leaving architecture altogether. Others stayed around a little bit or started to teach, and all were testing anything that would have to do with space, in other words, urban space, cities, but not using the word architecture. And at the time, I started to explore a series of totally, how could I say, self-motivated exploration about what is a city. But saying that it's not about what it looks like. It's about possibly what it does. And when you do ask such a question, you realize that our experience as citizens or as urban dwellers or as simply countryside, it's about a place, it's about movement, we move through it, and possibly it's about action. And I started to devise a sort of vocabulary, or rather organization of three squares, one of them always describing the action, the second one describing the plan, where it took place, and the third one, the diagram of the movement vectors, almost like you would diagram the movement of a dancer on a space. So that first intuitive exploration was about, indeed, finding a mechanism to tell a story, a narrative. The first episode was a park. You could say Central Park. I lived in Manhattan then. The second episode was about a street. And I was still trying to use the same device of the point line, the space, event, and movement. Talking about a street, in this case, the analogy of 42nd Street, was to use the same distinction between, at the top, action, at the middle, the space, and at the bottom, the movement vectors, and try to develop another reading of what architecture is, not simply as a plan or as a section, but also introducing the idea of movement, the idea of program. In this case, it's not really program, event is something slightly different. We may talk about it today, maybe not. And then continuing that exploration with another urban archetype, the tower, and saying, what is particular about a tower? It's that tower may have a series of spaces, but the particularity about movement, it's its verticality, it's the question of a fall. And here, once again, the mode of notation is about describing what happens, then the spaces, then the movement vectors, and how the movement vectors change the nature of the space itself. So it's very much an investigation, but it's not a scientific investigation. In other words, it's what I would say, it's a hypothesis one is making, and every drawing is a way to try to demonstrate it. The last episode was about a block, a typical Manhattan block, which was subdivided in a series of courtyards, of inner court. And then movement would be imported into it. Those of you who have practiced American football will recognize the diagrams and saying this movement diagram can be in a way solidified, in other words, an arrow of the movement of the person walking in space could actually be a piece of a wall. And so drawing these movement vectors and trying to give them a materiality was a fantastically interesting discovery. In other words, realizing that architecture is not only something that is about what it looks like, but how it is made and then what it does. So space, event, movement, which I just described, became somehow a way to organize a number of project rights at that time. What had happened after the Manhattan transcript, which I worked on them probably 4 to 5 years, one episode per year actually. At the moment when I thought, well, by now I know more or less where it's going, I thought, let's test it on one real project. Instead of writing the narratives myself, writing those mini stories, which were really like B-movies scripts, let's try to take an actual program, a program for competition. And indeed, there was an open competition at the time in the early 80s, 1982, of which practically everybody of my age group started to send proposals. And then, well, let me describe the site. The site was an industrial site with slaughterhouses. That's what it looked like. Much of the building were bound to be demolished, and the request was, let's do a park. Now, the word park is such a wide word, it can mean anything. So, because of the size of the place, it's literally 3/4 of a mile in one direction and half a mile in the other direction. To me, it's so big that I thought, let's look at urban precedents. So you've seen when I showed those images of those early sketches or early diagrams, early notations of the School of Architecture here at FIU. That's the very first drawing that I did. And simply, it's large, it's like a city. What are potential urban organizations? And that's really straightforward. You don't have to go into the library. You know, it can be a grid, it can be a concentric, it can be Baroque axis, etc., etc. Generally, you know, one knows this. And then there was one that interested me a little more. It's the one before last, that this series of dots, Le Corbusier's famous plan voisin. I was interested in it because throughout my studies, everybody had said how horrible that project was. And I thought, if everybody hates it, maybe there's something interesting. So I then, with all these diagrams, I started to put them on the site and see what happens. Now, the interesting thing about this, it's not yet selecting anything. It's testing it out. There is no value judgment here. There is no composition. It's just simply looking at what could work, what couldn't work, what it means. And amusingly, if you happen to be doing a competition, you realize that without knowing it, you've done half of the project of the other competitors. Because inevitably, there is a certain sort of number of combination and permutation that are inevitable in any architectural project. So, of course, the last one, the top one, the bottom right, was the one I decided to explore further. And still doing this quick diagram, you don't have to know how to draw, you just have to know how to think. So, and then you can do the same thing, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, 21st century. So at that time, you're starting to guess where you might be going. And that's at that time that I said, well, remember the Manhattan Transcript. There was something that was about space, there was something that was about movement, etc. So the program of the Parc de la Villette was a series of course, obvious garden areas, but also places for children, places for families, places for old people, places for music, places for sport. You could imagine anything you want, 500 pages of different committees putting things together, contradicting themselves. So I thought, okay, we have a system of points, which are where there is the action. That's one item. A system of movement, which is where the path, the routes are going to be, you know, where people go on that large 125-acre space, and a system of surfaces, of planes, that the public could appropriate as they wanted. Now, the important thing, and the creative one, was that these three systems of point, line, and surfaces were independent from one another. And then you would superimpose them. And then it would give you this. Now, this is not a composition, it's not a design, it's simply a strategy. Now, the strategy itself proved to be incredibly flexible because indeed you could have more or less of those red points. By the way, the red points, the follies, are not the most important part. The most important part is the superimposition of those three systems. So, and then they collide, the vectors of movement collide into the red buildings, etc., etc. The project becomes alive. So it's also about a dialogue which is established with things which are already there on the site. In other words, some 19th century building, some 20th century building, and all of them are not necessarily trying to be pieces of sculpture. No, they are a vocabulary that can transform itself depending on what happens inside each of them. So some were for music, some were for young children, some of them were for eating and so on, showing movies. So they were activators, or I would say generators. In other words, they were bringing some sort of attention between other parts that had maybe a different logic. Now you start to guess where I'm going to be driving at, considering where we're speaking. So I'll stand a little longer on movement notation. As you design path, you ask yourself, is it a path that is for fast movement, for slow movement, for distracted movement? And you start to look at modes of notation. How can you, if you draw a path or stairs, there are different ways to express it. And so these were what I call the cinematic promenade, starting to try to find a mode of expression that would, how could I say, emphasize acceleration or slowing down. And so eventually that translates into width and eventually directly into building. So I'm once again making the point that it starts by an idea, by a concept, and intuitively, or very, how can I say, rationally develop a translation of it. Let me show you another example. It's a competition that happened soon after that. A set of buildings which were completely derelict. They were banned. They were the requirement was to demolish it. The place had received its building permit, its demolition permit, and what the authorities wanted to build was a so-called Bauhaus of the 21st century, namely a place where artists could use film, sculpture, performance art, etc., to explore contemporary artistic practices. I went to see the building. I walked on the roof. I remember I think I was alone on that visit, and I was fascinated by those roofscapes. I was fascinated by the interior of that building, which had used an industrial vocabulary, but at the same time had been used for all sorts of entertainment things, like a circus or like a pony ride and things of this sort. And I thought, that's amazing. These spaces have ceilings which are much taller than anything my budget will allow me to build. So I thought, well, how's about keeping them? It's not that I was a so-called conservationist or preservationist. I was interested in them architecturally. Now the problem, they were leaking, they could not hold the weight of the snow. So I thought, hey, maybe there's something interesting. You know, one of the big issues in architecture is how you enclose something. So I said, well, if I put a big roof on top, right, then I'll keep the rain out, or some of it, but I'll keep the snow out. In that part in the north of France, that was one of the reasons why the building had received its demolition permit. It was supposedly unsafe. So just that idea of testing something, which at the time, it's provocative. But what is even more interesting is once you bring that roof on, there is an in-between, between the old roof and the new roof. What are you going to do with it? It's actually a fantastic space because you get it for free. Nobody's got to pay for it. It's void. So we just added a series of walkways. And the roof itself, which is more than a roof, it's then discovering the idea that, you know, one of the things that is really problematic in architecture is the idea of facade. It's really a drag to design a facade. However, when you realize that if you take your roof, you turn it 90 degrees and it becomes the vertical roof now, it's the facade. And not only that, if that is partly open so that it relates to the existing environment, in other words, the neighborhood, then you create something which is really interesting because it starts to address completely different issues, which have to do with, you know, who lives there, who are the people in the neighborhood, how does this interact? So what is happening, what I've shown you so far, was all about the concept of that over roof. But then slowly, the context start to, you know, interact with it. And interestingly enough, that was an era when people talked a lot about, quote, quote, postmodernism and the relationship between how to do so-called postmodern historicism. I was always very irritated with this type of fake arches or so, and thinking, well, look, it's not about imitating the past, it's establishing a dialogue with the past. So what you see on the left is part of the old building existing, and then you see the roof. The new roof is extremely useful because inside you can put all the mechanical system, all the ducts worked and so on, and put the additional fire escapes and so on. And then it brings something which is not about form, not about composition, it's about a strategy. And so the building itself is really the product of this establishing the dialogue between those different parts. That's where the concept is. So it's just as at La Villette, the concept is not the red follies. Here the concept is not the roof. It is the dialogue or the confrontation or the superimposition, juxtaposition. There are a number of words for that. But it's an active one. And then it becomes a place that artists appropriate and start to develop. And it develops, it forces you to develop architectural details and so on, especially for it. Right. So hence, I tend to use that sentence as a bit of a leitmotif of saying it's not, architecture is not, well, I say not only what it looks like, but also what it does. So that notion of a concept and a context is really fundamental because one somehow intersects with the other. So I'm going to give you a couple other examples of these context concept things. Before we started to work on this set of buildings here in Miami, we did another school of architecture. So that's, you know, this one. The other one was in just outside Paris, and it had roughly the same program, roughly the same size, but it was on a place where there's not that much sunshine, it rains a lot, and I thought, well, maybe if we want to have this gathering point, which I always like the idea of the courtyard, maybe it has to be covered. And then instead of using what I would use later, in other words, bricks or concrete or tiles, there it's wood and metal and a lot of glass, which you wouldn't really use in Miami later. So the particularity of the generators is that they are, as they are indoor, they have to play an acoustical role. They are acoustical sponges, and therefore there's acoustical absorbing material there. It's a cheap material, and then the place is covered, and the interior space is like an incredible, you know, public space, but indoor. So a few images of the building itself. So here you see that the materiality is, the concept is pretty identical to the one here at Miami FIU, but the materiality couldn't be more different. I'll give you another example of a double envelope of a concert hall in two concert halls, very large concert halls for 8,000 people. They're more for rock music and sports and events. So the first one has an inside envelope, which is made of concrete, where all the seats are supported, and the outside envelope is made of steel, and in between, because the in between is always important, is where the movement vectors are. So that's like during construction, and then the building is complete, then you see the movement vectors are, in a sense, activating that double envelope, and then when there is a particular spectacle also, there is that interesting architectural relation between the crowd and the movement themselves, in order to emphasize this important of the users. We decided to minimize the number of materials and have only steel and concrete, and then the steel were all made of transparent plastic, which created this rather surreal sort of feel that we were trying to reach. Now, the concert hall was very, very successful, so we were asked to do another one. But if the first site was very much what you see here, the second site was an incredible forest, 200-year-old trees. So I knew that the concept of the original building, of the first concert hall, worked fantastically well. So what would we do to approach a different context? So we said, well, the first one, we use steel and concrete. What about taking advantage of where we were and saying the outside would be translucent polycarbonate and the inside would be wood? So in other words, the materiality of the concept is in a sense a reflection, in this particular case, of the particularity of that 200-year forest, and with actually also a wood industry at the time. The reason why I bring this up, it's not simply a architectural game. It's much more than that. If you think of the world we live in, with climate change, with ecological questions, with even social questions, these issues of materialities are also ways you can go to the next step in terms of our particular predicament, which is very different now at the beginning of the 21st century than they were at the end of the 20th century. So, interestingly enough also is that, architecture is about a concept, as I mentioned, about perception, what it looks like, what you see, but it's also about experience. And what is amusing, but very important architecturally, is that the change of material changes completely your perception. In other words, it's not the same building anymore if it's made of transparent, polycarbonate versus wood. So this difference between concept, percept, and affect is a fascinating discovery that we all make as architects. In other words, it's also sensation. So I could simply make that point about concept and context, is saying context does not just mean shapes and style. Above all, it means place, climate, ecology, materiality, society, and so on. So, yes, architecture is not about the condition of design, but about the design of conditions. In other words, your way you approach any project is literally not simply be a so-called service provider. It's also you are designing conditions. I'll give you another, now completely reverse example, which is our museum at the Acropolis in Athens, where there, this time, we were really not starting from scratch. Imagine being asked to design a building next to probably the most famous building of Western civilization, the Parthenon. And second challenge, the site is filled with archaeological remnants that we have to preserve. And third challenge, really one of the purposes of that building is to repatriate, to bring back the marbles which are currently at the British Museum that, of course, the Greek society wants to get back to where it belongs. And of course, the British Museum, they're not terribly keen in returning it. So that triple challenge meant that in that particular case, you couldn't choose the context. It was there. So, but you could choose the concept. So this tripartite question of the Parthenon at the top, the necessity of finding a house for the famous Parthenon frieze, currently at the British Museum, and the archaeological remnants were the starting point of the project. And again, diagrams of these three parts, how they're brought together, and then eventually the building, which is in a way pushing the mode of thinking as far as one can. The building itself, above the ruins, seeing the Parthenon in the background, staying low, staying so that it would be aligned with the roof top of the city of Athens. And then the building itself continues this conversation with the ruins below the main part of the building, and then at the top, well, here it becomes even a game of watching down through it. And the movement through it becomes incredibly important. In other words, it's part of what I call a narrative. It's a storytelling. It's also a way to devise a certain, possibly spectacular spaces within it. That's the interior courtyard. And then play that materiality issue where the columns themselves are made of concrete which absorb the light, and the statues are made of polished marble, and you want that distinction between what reflects the light, the sculptures, and what absorb the light, the concrete structures. So at every moment, you're always looking for the simplest possible way to develop an argument. And I would say that any building is a way, it's in a way is an argument. Every building is a way to demonstrate a hypothesis. So the frieze itself, and amusingly enough, of course, the frieze is something that you can watch only as you walk along it. So it is a movement vector, a little bit like that early drawing in the Manhattan transcript, which was 32 feet long. So you could only see it by walking along. And I get fascinated by things which would take too long to discuss tonight, this afternoon, is the certain conversation that filmmakers may have with sculptors, architects may have with filmmakers. In this particular case, the frieze was the subject, the frieze from 2,500 years ago was the subject of a film by an avant-garde filmmaker in the 1930s, which influenced me on the Manhattan transcript another 40 years later. So these things are a longer discussion, but important because we don't work in isolation. Some pieces of the museum. And I'll show you two more schemes very briefly. This time, still talking about that dialogue, or what I would call that conversation. We were asked to provide tools for thinking about a site in China, not about an hour from Beijing, which looked like that 30 years ago or 40 years ago, a really industrial site. And it was disused, it was dangerous, it was falling apart. And we were asked to conceive a science museum, a science and industry museum that would pay homage to that incredible era. The site was fairly nondescript and banal in terms of what had been proposed by traffic transportation engineer, and I started to pay homage to this incredible industrial past. And I was interested in the abstract configuration of those archetypal industrial pieces. And while I never work in terms of, how can I say, of decorative sort of post-rationalization, I was interested in trying to see to which extent those typologies, I use the word typologies on purpose here, those industrial types could be potentially turned into an exciting museum. And these are construction photographs. It's, of course, at the scale of China. It's absolutely gigantic. You could put easily 2 Guggenheim Museums in these atriums. the building itself became a series of those empty cones where exhibitions can be. These are not renderings, by the way. These are photographs. And the movement vectors become, I don't have here the photograph with the crowds, but you can imagine how suddenly something that is looked at first as an abstraction, but based on a historical context, can become the building itself. The last project that I'm going to show you is, in a way, coming back to that issue of the generators. It's a building that is being finished at this very moment as we speak. It's nearly 1 million square feet for a center for biology, chemistry, and pharmacy for the University of Paris. And also it had been a competition, we won it, and the issue to me had more to do that in white is the site. So you see the scale of the site. It's incredible. It takes it's nearly a mile from one end to the other. So once again, it's like, thinking about it not as an individual building, but more as something which is in dialogue with its surrounding, and something which is, in a sense, activated through what I called generators or activators. And so you to remember this. In the case of the Paris building, here the question of the movement through it and at which moment you develop it as a place of intensity of generator became one of the main challenges. These are early diagrams at the time, as you've seen my, working, and then eventually you arrive at a plan. But the important thing that I want to show is not so much this part of it, or some of the tests with the facade, the use of color and so on, but it's really those activators, those generators, which happen to be, in that particular case, a series of auditoriums. Eventually we built two. One became so much bigger that we had to locate it elsewhere. And so the whole project is about a long movement vector. In other words, it's a linear route that is the place of various episode and event. The building from the outside as the first, and then all these bridges that connect in a place which, again, it's not the weather of Miami, it has to be protected. And so it becomes an interesting landscape of bridges and envelopes, and the building, the main entrance hall is very large. It's about 75 feet high and 300 feet long, and inside of it is where you have those generators of activities. And here is some of the renderings. This is actually an actual photograph, and here that's again an actual photograph. And somehow, as I was preparing to this a few days ago, I thought, hey, somehow there's something that I find interesting, is that while it's 25 years ago, some of the very early premises of that latest building may have been found here at Miami FIU. Thank you very much. So I can take a few questions if you want, if it's not too late.
Can I go first? Is there any way
after the lecture, can you sign me one book that I have? Please, just please.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a question here.
Yeah.
Amazing lecture. Why red?
You know, I'll tell you, I've been asked that question many times, and I never answer.
You said something earlier that caught my attention. You said we don't work in isolation. So my question is not about Bernard Tschumi, the architect, but the person outside the studio. What kind of music do you listen? What kind of books? Can you share with us like something about yourself that inspired you?
Okay. Actually, that's a very good question. It's a very personal one. At the office, we just don't have background music. People have their own headphones and so on. However, when I work, say when I'm in an airplane, right, you want to isolate yourself. From the time I was a kid, I remember, you know, I spent a year in the US when I was 17 or so. And I remember going to clubs in New York where you had blues singers, you know, John Lee Hooker and a few others. And the very repetitive nature of it was something that made it, for me, a sort of incredibly pleasant way to keep concentration. So in a sense, music is a way to not, it's not about music per se, it's about keeping one's concentration. In terms of reading, you know, it can be anything, from junk to very serious things that Neil Leach can tell you about. So, yeah, but perhaps more importantly is that indeed it's about that overall context, yes.
Hey, Tschumi. You mentioned at one point the poetics of architecture, and I wanted to get sort of a clearer understanding what you meant by poetics outside of the rational, you know, sort of processes that we usually do in architecture. Like what kind of, how do you make those decisions? You have sort of a playful nature when it comes to circulation, like you sort of mentioned in most of your projects. So how do you make these decisions? Like, are they purely just intuitive, or is there sort of a, I know you showed plenty of diagrams, but, you know, I'm just curious.
Do you know something? Last night, flying to Miami, I was trying to write about what you just asked me about. And I've been trying now for 5 years. And I think I'm slowly getting there. Namely, in terms of what I showed tonight, I'm trying to weave in a fairly rational process from, you know, a concept to a context and back again. However, there are moments when it's not quite so linear. And a very close friend of mine asked me the same question 5 years ago. And I've been trying to answer that question. In reality, there is a moment when indeed you use the incredible power that you have as an architect to pull out a joker's card and do what you think you want to do. And that joker's card is either the product of the juxtaposition of impossible things together. The surrealists were incredibly good at expressing, or they used a quote, which they talked about the chance encounter between an umbrella and a sewing machine on top of a dissecting table. This impossible relation is what I would call the poetic effect. And I'm interested at which moment architecture goes beyond being a simple building, but reaches poetic. But wait till I finish writing. Thank you for the question. Maybe we should leave it at that. Thank you very much.